Okay, we are now recording and the meeting is live.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Hey, everyone. This is the April 7th edition of Presto TSC Meeting. It's been a while that we couldn't come together, and we are back today with like 4 agenda items. And the first one is about a remote Presto event that we are organizing. I see Amit on the line. Okay, let's see. Amit just dropped actually, and I can start with the first agenda item. Amit is organizing this event with various Uber folks and LF folks. So this event will be on April 24th. So please save the date. It's roughly like in 2 weeks, and there will be multiple talks from Facebook engineers and possibly an Uber talk as well. And so please save the date, and like the event will be online, and we will share the Zoom links and other connection information in the next few days probably. So and we can move to the second agenda item, which is about reviewing the changes to the README file. Brian, can you give us some context about it?
Sure. So there are 2 new pull requests that are open. I opened these up yesterday. And one of them contains basically the changes that the TSC has already reviewed. And these are, some of the expansions on things like how and when to choose TSC members and what the election process and nomination process looks like and all of that. I had broken these out into a separate PR just because I think they've been discussed and we've reached general consensus on most things. And it would be nice to get this merged and basically just to get it done. So that is PR 43. And I'll drop the link into the chat here, and I'll also pull it up on my screen and share it. One moment. Okay, there's the PR, and in just a moment I will share what's in here. Okay, so there are a few changes in here, and basically we have everything we had discussed previously, adding the terms of the TSC voting members. In the last meeting, we discussed having a 3-year term instead of a 2-year term, so that less of the TSC is up for replacement at any given time. And this is reflected here. So now it's 1/3 of the seats are elected each year. That's the only change from the last time you saw the draft that we have here. The other thing was that I removed the line in here that was about needing to be a committer in order to be on the TSC. And the reason I removed that is it's still under active discussion. In fact, this is one of the agenda items later on. And I wanted to hold off putting anything in here lest this hold up the rest of the PR. I think the rest of this is reasonably well discussed at this point. So one of the things I'd like to suggest and like to get your input on is whether we can put this particular chunk of text up for a vote so we can just get it merged and done. So any thoughts on this? Any concerns with doing it this way, breaking it out into pieces?
Yeah, I got a question. Like, can you elaborate on the changing the composition of the TSC section a bit?
Yeah. So in the charter, I'll bring up the actual page in the charter here. In the charter, the total number of TSC members is set to 15 unless the TSC sets a new maximum limit by supermajority vote. So the charter grants the TSC the ability to increase or decrease the number of TSC members, or sorry, the number of TSC seats that are available. And the reason for putting this in here in this particular way is that the most sensible time to adjust the size of a TSC is at election time. That's the easiest time because then we can ensure there's balance and that the classes, the 1-year 2-year and 3-year classes are roughly equivalent to each other. Otherwise, this can be done really at any time, and the TSC just needs to have a supermajority vote from the existing voting members. So kind of bringing all of this together, Nezzy, to answer your question, the reason for putting it in here this way is to suggest that if there are going to be changes, the most opportune time to make those changes is around a vote. It's just logistically much easier that way. But at the same time, it's put into the charter where it can happen at any time.
Oh, okay, that makes
sense. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
Does anyone have any other comments on any other sections?
All right. Should we move on to the next?
Yeah, we can move on to the next one. Folks, if you have comments, please drop your comments on PR 43, and then we can continue the conversation there.
Okay, the next agenda item is PR 46. And this adds some additional policies. And just maybe for some context here, I've been working on trying to roll out some policies across a variety of different projects here that seem to be helpful elsewhere. And we haven't discussed these yet, which is why I broke these out into a separate PR. I didn't want to hold up the work on the other, on getting the other one merged. But there are a couple of things which would be added, starting here at the policies and procedures heading and moving down. And I'll walk through each one of these in turn. I'm not asking for a vote or suggesting a vote or anything. I just want to get everybody comfortable with these ideas so you can start thinking about whether or not these make sense for the Presto TSC. So the first thing here is a line on making decisions, and this is just basically echoing the language from the charter, which says that decision is on a consensus basis, and then if consensus isn't reached, then a vote is possible. It's also adding in here that votes, are taken over email and documented in the next meeting. This is fairly standard practice. It's easier to track. There's a record of the vote, that sort of thing. The next thing is a policy which I'm proposing here, which other projects have used, about how and when to merge PRs into the TSC repository. And the TSC repo is kind of a special entity, given that it's largely documentation of procedures and governance and things like that. And so what other projects have done is they say there are certain requirements that have to be met if we're going to change one of the policies or one of the governance items. The numbers here, the requirements here, these are all flexible, but they're just basically put here for your consideration. One of them is that there are no -1s. This does allow, if a TSC voting member has serious objection to something, they can hold the merging of a PR, which changes governance or changes policies, with a -1. There's a minimum number of approvals required, and then also a minimum time. And the idea here is that we are in a virtual team. We're not always going to be meeting, we meet every month or every few weeks or sometimes every few months if that's the case. It's kind of important, if there are going to be changes, to give people enough time to review them, taking into account time zones, weekends, and PTO. And so that's the reason for having a few people explicitly sign off and for having a PR be open for a certain period of time. The other thing to be aware of here is that changes to the charter are explicitly mentioned in the last section of the charter. So it is possible for the TSC to update the charter by 2/3 vote, supermajority vote. What this adds to it is the amount of time it would take before declaring that this is done. Basically, the last thing that's in this section, Nezzy and I discussed this a little bit on an issue last night, is if there's a meeting that has quorum and has sufficient voting members in order to pass, a vote on one of the PRs, then it can just be done live in the meeting. There's no reason to wait out the entire period if everybody's there and discussing it anyhow. So it's kind of it accelerates this process a bit. Does that all make sense as an idea? Does anybody have any thoughts or concerns about a process like this?
Makes sense to me.
No.
All right, great. So the next section is about fast tracking. And again, this is just adding some structure around what happens if there's a trivial change. Like, for example, if I were to push something and have a spelling error and somebody wants to change it, it would be ridiculous for that to wait 72 hours for a fix. So certain PRs can be fast tracked if they meet the criteria here, errata or editorial changes or uploading meeting minutes or whatever. And essentially this basically, if you were to open a PR, you can add a fast track label and then a few people sign off on it and then it just gets merged. So the idea here is don't create a waiting period for things that don't need a waiting period. On the other hand, changes to the charter, this does say that changes to the charter would not be fast tracked. Because those are usually things which require a substantial amount of deliberation and want to make sure that everybody's had a chance to really read and digest. Any questions about this one? All right. And then there's just a few more things in here. There's a link off to the IP policy. Generally a good idea to at least link off to this in a variety of different places so it's more discoverable. The Linux Foundation, with regards to copyright notices and files, the Linux Foundation's published some guidance on this for community best practices of, contributors to files. If you are making a contribution to one of the files in the Presto repo, you don't necessarily need to add a copyright line to the top of the file. In fact, in many circumstances, we don't recommend it. And all of that's detailed behind this link. This is one of the reasons for suggesting this and for including this in the README is that this is one of the areas where we get a lot of questions. Contributors will ask, okay, at what point do I need to add my copyright line? Is it essential that I do this? And really the only rule is really hard, fast, and set in stone is do not modify somebody else's copyright notice. As for everything else, the thinking I think has evolved on this over the years. And now essentially there's, we're trying to keep the headers of files as clean as possible and minimal as possible. So if there's no specific reason to add it, the guidance here is, you don't really need to bother with that. Speaking of keeping things clean and tidy in the tops of files, we also do suggest that SPDX short identifiers are a good way to signal license information. And this can be useful in a couple of different senses. One is that it's a very minimal way of indicating a license on a file. So if that file is likely to make its way into other repos or other projects, it's clear what the license was, and it goes with the file. It's not a file in the repo itself. And the second reason for doing this is that it does help out for automated code scanning. So it's a hygiene thing. We don't, in other projects, we don't mandate this. It's not a requirement. But at the same time, if you're making an edit to a file and you see there's no license identifier at the top of the file, it's a relatively trivial add. And those are the changes. Does anybody have any questions about these? Any concerns with any of these?
I get one question. In the merging PRs into the TSC repository section, the last sentence, like if consensus cannot be reached, can you elaborate on that process when the consensus is not reached?
Yeah, so essentially this is saying that if there's not agreement and a vote is forced, then the vote would override the objections. So for example, in a situation where there's something which is somewhat controversial and most of the TSC members agree, but one person has objected, that objection prevents there from being consensus. So you can't say there's a consensus merge, we can just go ahead and put this in. At that point, then it does require a formal vote. Gail or I can organize that. We'll send out the email, collect the responses. And if the vote comes back with the majority saying this thing should be merged, or supermajority if it's a charter change, then at that point, the PR can go through. So there can be a block. You can block something from consensus, but the block can be overridden by a vote.
And then it says like to override outstanding objections. Basically, it can override like multiple objections until unless the objections are the majority, right? So
correct. Yes, I mean it just functions the same as a normal vote, right? Because in a normal vote, even when you object, if you're if the majority are going the other direction, then the vote passes. Yeah.
Any other questions about this PR? Okay, so this was PR 46. And folks, please review it and then please leave some comments and feedback. And then we can continue the conversation offline in the TSC repository. And I guess we can move to the next agenda item, which is eligibility to be on the TSC, which is the issue 38 on the repository. Brian, you want to give some context on this one?
Sure, let me bring it up. Oh, hang on. Those issue 38. Okay, yeah, so this is one that we have been discussing for the past few meetings, and this is the one I specifically removed this from the rest of the PR so that we could break this out as a separate conversation. And the question is, what should the requirements be in order to be eligible for a TSC seat? And originally we had in here that TSC members should be committers or must be committers. And there's been, there are a couple different ways to do this. One of them, which many projects will do, is they'll say, TSC members, a certain percentage of the TSC members are committers, or, there's a certain number of seats that are reserved for people who are not involved in code development and wouldn't get code development or code committer status. We had a discussion in the last meeting that this can sometimes lead to situations where people who are not actually contributing code gain committer status so that they're eligible for the TSC. Examples would be, folks who work on maybe documentation or end users or situations like that. But at the same time, this is very particular to each project. Right. So each project has different requirements for what you would need to do in order to be eligible for a TSC seat. Zhen Xiao had some suggestions here. It's the last comment on the thread here that maybe if the person doesn't need to be a committer explicitly, maybe there are specific things which they, specific conditions which they would need to meet. Proving that they have sufficient technical expertise and a sufficient commitment to the project. I'd like to open this up for suggestion. It's up on the screen here, or open this up for discussion. Zhen Xiao, would you like to add anything to what I just described there?
Sure. Yeah, that's just my thoughts on that. And I was thinking, even if let's say the new TSC member, he's not contributing code or not contributing lots of code, but he needs to be very involved in the community and also help the design and also contribute some amount of code and be familiar with the community. So that's my thoughts. So the things in my mind is 4 items. One is he needs to be active in code review for the past year. And also he need to drive 2 designs. This part is he didn't do the coding, or he do some of the coding. He drive the design, and then he also drive the implementation, and finally the features emerged. And also he need to be in expertise in at least one specific area, for example, optimizer, a connector, or some other things. And also he need to be active in code commits for the past year. This means he may not be contribute as much code as the other committers, but he need to contribute some code. Yeah. I love to see what other others think about these things. These are just my thoughts.
Any other thoughts on this one, folks?
Should we take this one to the mailing list? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
Rebecca.
no.
I was just going to say that I think that those 4 requirements are maybe a bit more strict than I would be inclined to impose. As far as like, I'm thinking like if you have someone who's more like documentation or user side or focused on, you know, some particular, you know, connector or integration, I'm wondering if they would meet those requirements, and I could imagine that they could still be valuable contributors to the TSC.
Yeah, my thoughts on the documentation side, for example, so Presto, the documentation is also in the code repo, right? So if someone drive the, let's say he or she contribute lots of things to the documentation, then he already have a number of commits to the code repo. So for documentation side, that shouldn't be a problem. For the user side, I do not have a strong opinion. I do not know. But how can we evaluate? Let's say he's a strong user or strong customer. Yeah, this part I'm not clear.
And even for the documentation example that Rebecca gave, which I think is a good example, like Jin Shao, like how about item 2 in your proposal? Like you say like propose 2 plus big feature design. So that basically rules out any committers that haven't contributed any major design changes. And like how strict is your proposal about item 2? Like if you consider all these 4 items as a must, that may be a little bit too strict and filter out a lot of folks.
No, this number one, this 4 things just in my mind. I'm not saying it's a must to meet all of these, and I'm thinking about these for the non-committer TSCs. Yeah, I would say if someone become a committer, he automatically become a TSC. And for if we are thinking about someone who's not a committer, I think we should be strict, because how can we evaluate someone has the contribution to become a TSC?
Any other comments from, especially either from TSC members on the call, or questions?
So maybe I missed this, but is the idea that all of these things are required, or that there are some of these required, or that these are guideposts to basically say this is the type of thing that we're looking for? Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, again, this is just in my mind. I'm not saying this is we should do this. I love to see how the other thinking about this. I think for if someone become a committer, then so I do not have other requirements. But for non-committer TSC, these are the 4 suggested items to be met for the non-committer TSC.
Okay, so one of the things that I can suggest here in other projects, what we've done is we have a nomination template, self-nomination template that people who are hoping to run for a seat would have to complete. And essentially it's, it's a candidate information form. It's here are the things which I have done. Here's why I think I'll be, helpful to or useful in the seat. And here's why I think that I would be a strong candidate. And one of the ways that other projects have handled this, where they say there are certain criteria we'd like to see, is that they include those as examples in the self-nomination template. And, essentially not having all of the boxes checked would not be a blocker, but at the same time, it does give candidates an idea of what they should have done or what they should be talking about, so that the people who are doing the election can have a reasonably informed election. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, if we are doing this propose and approve mode, I think that's good by the existing committers and TSC members to approve that. I think that's good. Yeah, this is just my suggested items because I think we should be have something to quantify the evaluation for especially for non-committer TSCs.
Yeah.
I'm not
Actually, I agree with Jean-Charles. I don't
Yeah.
feel like having a non-quantified rules to allow any TSC members to be nominated is bad. Actually, we need to put lists. It's like, hey, at least for examples, hey, if some of TS members they are not committers got nominated, we need to have at least some examples. Say, hey, what kind of contribution this guy has been done.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then to help us move forward here, how about I take a crack at drafting a nomination template, self-nomination template that includes these things. It says please describe how you've what you've done that would qualify under these particular criteria. And then maybe that'll help. If we can agree on a template, then maybe that'll help us determine whether we've got the criteria right.
Yeah, that sounds like a good starting point for further discussion.
Okay.
And in other projects, do other projects have strict quantifiable guidelines like this, or is it more like a judgment call from the existing TSC members?
It is almost always a judgment call. And the reason for that is that whenever there are strict guidelines, almost immediately there will be an exception to those.
Yeah, that's my concern as well.
yeah. At the same time, if it's totally wide open, then it's very difficult to actually evaluate various candidates, particularly if you have a limited number of seats. So I think considering these as guidelines so that you can evaluate stronger versus weaker candidates certainly helps, but then having that flexibility to select somebody who maybe wasn't anticipated or contemplated when the guidelines were created, that's also very good as well.
Yeah, I think I like the idea that when people self-nominate, they should explicitly tell how they have contributed in the past. And we can have at least some soft guidelines, like Jean-Charles or like James mentioned, some soft guidelines, and then the TSC will just do their judgment call and then decide. I think that sounds like a good start.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say it helps with transparency in all directions. So, for example, if somebody say Nezi, if you're running, then you would be filling out the same template as everybody else. If we have this, and it'd be it provides a fair amount of transparency in the process. So whether it's somebody who's completely new, somebody who's just getting started, whether it's somebody who has been here for a long time, everybody's doing the same thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. I think like we can move to the last item. And like if folks have any other comments, it's this eligibility is the issue 38 on the TSC repo. So please take a look. So the last item is creating a Presto Foundation directory. So Brian,
Yes.
again, back to you.
Back to me. So I have been writing a few GitHub actions recently, and one of the ones that I've been doing is one that automatically creates a directory of various people and various teams in the project, and then also creates and manages mailing lists behind them. The idea here, we use groups.io for the mailing lists. It's not always clear who's supposed to be on what lists. Like, for example, the TSC list, or if there were a code of conduct panel, or if there were other working groups. And I mean, Gail or I can always create these lists. We can help moderate them and we can help manage them. But it's oftentimes better if the project can do that themselves, because then they have, a lot more direct control, and Gail and I aren't a bottleneck. To give you an example, I have one of these up for OpenJS Foundation. Give me just 1 second to find it. It is right here. This is what it looks like. We've only got a few teams on here because I'm still in the process of onboarding folks. Let's go to the actual directory itself for the cross-project council. And the idea here is that you can create a directory of who your voting members are. This is all created dynamically from a YAML file, but voting members, the members of a particular group, various community health links, and then you can point people to this and say, here's who the leadership is of this particular project. So the Presto TSC, here's who's on the TSC, here's where you find our various ways to contact us, here are links to our governance, here are the people, here are the repositories, and it's all configured based upon a based upon a YAML file, so that if you want to change your own information, if you want to add yourself or remove yourself from a list, you don't need to go log into groups.io. You don't need to ask for somebody else to do it for you. You can just open a pull request and do it yourself. So the idea here is, let's make everything as self-manageable as we possibly can. Is this the sort of thing that would be useful for Presto? If it is, I can set it up and handle all the configuration. And then at that point, if there are any other mailing lists you'd like for me to create and manage this way, we can do that. Or is it something that would be, not useful?
Currently, I think it would be useful, because currently the information is kind of distributed across other places. Like, for example, the Slack, Twitter, whatever, all these communication channels are listed on the Presto DB website, and the maintainers of the project are listed on GitHub. So they are like distributed around. I think it may help to have them centralized so that we can just share easily and like publicize easily. I think that would be one benefit of it.
Okay.
I don't know what other folks think.
Yep, it's a good idea.
All right. Does anybody have any concerns? I mean, do we have consensus here? I can also prototype it and show you what it looks like, and then you can decide. That's probably a better way to do it.
Yeah. Sounds good. Sounds like there are no objections.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so
I will take an action. I'll get this set up and I'll send it out.
Yep, thank you, Brian. So this was the last item, but I would like to go back to the first item again, because I see Amit on the line. Amit, can you also give some information about the virtual event on April 24, please?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so let me just switch to my email here. So on 24th April, we are looking to do a small virtual meetup. This is essentially something that we promote to our meetup group in the Bay Area and a couple of other channels that we have on Slack and Facebook and LinkedIn, to basically just stay connected with our community. The idea is that we'll have 2 speakers right now from Facebook, and we're going to talk about SQL functions, and I think the other one is from Andre Presto on Spark. 20-minute presentations with a small Q&A, and we'll do it over Zoom. So I'll be getting out the invites along with my colleagues at Uber, who are also helping me out get this up and running. Yeah, that's pretty much it. A very simple meetup. We're just experimenting, given the circumstances right now that we won't have a chance to do any physical meetups. We're trying to stay in touch with our community through that. Any specific questions, comments from folks?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ahmed, for the information. So we are out of agenda items. Before we wrap up, are there any other items that you would like to discuss right now? Looks like there aren't any. Okay, then thank you very much for joining us today, and take care and stay safe. We will see each other again, hopefully in the next 2 weeks. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.